First of all, I want to say this is, I think, my third Humanities week, and I want to thank everybody, Helen and the external relations team, for putting this together, and of course Dean Wildner Bassett. Every year when I come to these things, it's really exciting, and I'm reminded of what a great college we have. So it's always fun to be a part of this. Okay, let's see if I can get this thing to work. I can get that to work. Well, I'll just have to do it this way. All right. So I want to just say a couple of things. Now, unfortunately, I'm not talking about insult today. So a little bit of insult, yeah. No, I'm not dealing much with insult today, but what I'm dealing with are the ways that Dante represents Jewish people in his work, primarily in the Divine Comedy. And I've got to say at the outset that he doesn't really come out and just make programmatic statements. So what we're going to have to do is sort of go through his work and find different passages that relate to the way he represents the Jews, and then sort of pull it all together, relate it back to other teachings and attitudes from the Middle Ages. So I just wanted to set that up as we get going. Now, the impetus for this talk was actually a news item out of Italy, and you can see it up here, in March of 2013. The human rights group Gerush 92 called for Dante's comedy to be banned from Italian schools. The headline is clear, and it's up there. It's Dante, anti-Semite and Islamophobe. The Divine Comedy should be removed from school programs. The rationale was based on a number of passages from the comedy, including the damnation of Judas in Inferno 34 and the explanation of the abject condition of diaspora Jews as a result of deicide in Paradiso 7. Now, part of the controversy, or probably actually the polemical stance that Gerush 92 was taking, is the role that Dante's comedy has always played in the nation-building program of the Italian state, which was from about 150 some odd years ago, actually more now. Like many European states, Italy's nation builders turned not to a founding document such as the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution like in the United States, but rather to the extensive literary, cultural, and artistic heritage of the territory. Dante, in short, is viewed as something more than a medieval author. And just to put this in perspective, Dante was born in 1265 and he died in 1321. Instead, he's treated as a type of father of the country, or as he was frequently referred to in the 19th century, the father of the Italian language. He therefore occupies a role kind of akin to a combination between William Shakespeare and Thomas Jefferson, a touchstone of Italian literary and literature and artistry, and a kind of an iconic figure of Italy, kind of like a Thomas Jefferson, or if you will, Italianness. Now, the interest in Dante's representation of the Jews is nothing new. In the 19th century, there was a debate about Dante's interpersonal relationship with the Jewish poet Emmanuel from Rome. His actual name was Emmanuel ben Solomon. He also was born in 1265 and died in 1331, about a decade after Dante. Emmanuel was born into the Zifroni family, and he lived in Perugia, Fabriano, Fermo, Ancona. He moved around through northern Italy. He wrote commentaries on the books of the Old Testament in Hebrew and an extensive compendium of Hebrew poetry entitled Machbarat, which means collection. Incidentally, among the poems of the Machbarat are several sonnets in Hebrew, making Emmanuel the first known poet to translate the poetic form of the sonnet out of Italian and into another language. It had actually been invented in the 1230s in Sicily, and so it's a distinctly Italian form at this time. The last portion of his Machbarat consists of a journey to the afterlife, both heaven and hell, accompanied by the prophet Daniel, or in Italian, Daniele. Many people have seen this as a Judaization of the comedy, with Daniele, standing in for Dante, and the explanation goes Daniele, Dante. Personally, I find the connection to be an extremely forced argument, but you will still find it among scholarship about Emmanuel of Rome. Furthermore, Emmanuel wrote 5 poems in Italian, 4 of which are sonnets, one of which is a lament over the death in 1321, the death of Dante, in 1321. Now, 19th century scholars like Giosuè Carducci viewed these writings as evidence of a friendship between Dante and Emmanuel. That conclusion was incautious, to say the least, and is pretty roundly rejected by scholars. But it fit with the 19th century program of building a modern republic based in part on freedom of belief. That goes back to that nation state, that nation building I was referring to earlier. The idea being that if ultra-Catholic Dante could be friends with the Jewish Emmanuel of Rome, then the modern state of Italy did not need to be, strictly speaking, a Catholic country. Rather, it could accommodate people of all creeds. Now, at the time, other people also wrote about Dante's attitudes towards the Jews. Right at the turn of the 20th century, Rodolfo Mondolfi published a small pamphlet entitled, well, I'll translate the title, it's The Jews, What Afterworld Realm Awaits Them in Dante's Comedy. His conclusion, even though they're not mentioned explicitly, for Dante, the Jews must end up in limbo. Limbo is where the unbaptized go. There's absolutely nothing surprising about this conclusion, and it's kind of weird that somebody would actually publish a pamphlet on it. So what's the point? The point is that Dante, father of the Italian language, was relatively benevolent to the Jews. He did not put the Jews farther down in hell, not among the usurers, who were all Christians for Dante, and certainly not among the traitors. Yes, Judas Iscariot is in the lowest pit of the treasonous, but that's specific to his crime of betraying Jesus. Lastly, in the 1970s, a monumental work, the Dante Encyclopedia, the Enciclopedia Dantesca, was compiled. The entry under Jews, Judeo, ends with the sentence, and again I'm translating, Dante cannot be accused of anti-Semitism, but no text indicates a direct relationship with contemporary Jews. Now, that's a very interesting statement. With the memory of World War II and its horrors still very fresh in Italian memories, such a statement makes sense on an intuitive level. Dante may have expressed some views in the comedy that we now disagree with, but really, let's not lump him in with the goose-steppers who are marching around from a few decades ago. The entry in the Enciclopedia Dantesca, this Dante encyclopedia, is really important for this discussion because it says the word anti-Semitism outright, and therefore it allows us to then discuss this question of anti-Semitism head on. And that's the point of this quick overview that I'm giving you of this discussion at the beginning of this talk. What we see starting in the 19th century and culminating with Garouche 92 is a whole lot of dancing around this term anti-Semite. Some of them are saying it, some aren't, but it's clearly standing behind all of this. And speaking personally as a scholar, when I see a whole lot of dancing of this type, it says something really important to me. And it says, we're debating the wrong thing. Now let me explain. So far, the question posed, whether implicitly or explicitly, has been whether Dante is anti-Semitic. Some people are saying, no, why? Some of his friends were Jewish. Or he's simply echoing the beliefs at the time. And others are saying, yes, look at how he's discussing deicide, that is, the killing of Jesus, or more broadly, the killing of God, or look at how he treats Judas. The problem is, in my opinion, we're discussing the wrong question. In order to discuss the question correctly, we need to look closely at this term anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is actually a concept that developed in the 19th century, and as such was steeped in 19th and early 20th century views about race. To put it bluntly, anti-Semitism is actually a racial concept. Humanity, to spell it out, could be divided into distinct races, they believed, each of which had its own characteristics of physiology, skin tone, physical features, and so on, but also of psychology, intelligence, temperament. Some races were viewed as naturally more intelligent or creative or curious, and others better suited to manual labor, and others still prone to sexuality, coarse sexuality, or outright criminality. The notion of anti-Semitism taught that Jews were one such race who, by dint of their common biology, also shared these common characteristics, irrespective of creed. Now, to put it very bluntly, the ultimate application of anti-Semitic thought was brought about by this guy. The Nazis, of course, who murdered Jews regardless of their religious beliefs and practices. They killed people who they racially defined as Jewish, whether they were Orthodox, unobservant, agnostic, atheistic, or converts to Christianity. Like all racist approaches, anti-Semitism casts the question in terms of biology, or more generally speaking, of heritage. Prior to the 19th century, the more accurate term for the denigration of Jews would be anti-Judaism. Put simply, anti-Judaism is a view about the insufficiency of the Jewish religion and ritual practices, primarily relative to Christianity. Simply following the laws of Moses was viewed as imperfect because Jesus fulfilled the ancient prophecies and replaced the old law, Judaism, with the new. Anti-Judaism is actually a very old tradition in Christianity, and you find its roots actually in the books of the New Testament. The epistles of Paul, for instance, challenge the continued legitimacy of the Jewish tradition, and he argues that Christianity, or I should say the followers of Jesus, because they didn't view themselves as distinct at that point, they were Jews but a particular branch of Judaism, and he argues that the Christ followers were actually the true Judaism, the new Israel, supplanting the old. As Christianity was developing, the early Christians actually needed to distinguish themselves from the practitioners of the old law, and the need to do so became even more acute after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE and the expulsion of the Jews thereafter from Israel. With the Jews then viewed as pariahs throughout the Roman Empire, the early Christians drew a distinction between themselves and the other more traditional Jews. Indeed, as Christianity made greater inroads among the Gentiles, the latter, the Gentiles, who were renewed and rehabilitated through Christianity, came to actually supplant the Jews as God's chosen in their minds. Now, as time went on, and readings of the Old Testament as anticipating or foretelling the New Testament, as anticipating Jesus, became very prevalent, the question of why the Jews did not recognize Christ also became discussed. Why couldn't they see, people started asking, that their sacred books consistently point to Jesus as the Messiah? This is the Christian view. St. Augustine offered the interpretation of the Jews as spiritually blind. That is, they couldn't see Christ, the reality of Jesus. But other people came to see them as more sinister. Not as a people unable to see Jesus' divinity, but as deliberate unbelievers. They knew the truth, they just didn't want to accept it. And here we see the conceptual link between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. It is a quick pass from viewing Judaism as an insufficient religion, now surpassed by the advent of Jesus. Oh, sorry, I lost my spot here. There we go. To drawing ugly conclusions about the nature of those Jews who simply couldn't see what the Christians believed was the obvious truth about the divinity of Christ. And you hear this throughout the Middle Ages. Odo of Cambrai, who lived between 1050 and 1113, asserted that the Jews resembled animals because they didn't use their natural reason to simply convert to Christianity. Guibert of Nogent, again about the same period, 1055 to 1124, claimed that the Jews were a carnal people concerned with appetites, their appetites, I should say, and that explained their refusal to accept Christ. Now, part of the negative perspective of the Jews had to do with their purported crime of deicide. That is, they were collective guilt in the killing of Jesus, that is, the killing of God. This, too, it should be added, is based in the New Testament. As when the Jews call for Christ's crucifixion, adding, and this is a quote, let his blood be on us and on our children. That's from Matthew verse 27, chapter 27, verse 25. Deicide, as we shall see, is one of the central charges leveled against the Jews throughout the Middle Ages. By repudiating Christ, the Jews forfeited their status as God's chosen people. The fundamental explanation for the diaspora of the Jews from Israel in 70 CE was as collective punishment for their role in the crucifixion of Christ. Now, like any system of thought, there is a range of attitudes within anti-Judaism, and I'm just going to cite a couple of examples here to illustrate my point. The first example is from the Decameron, which was written between 1348 and 1351. And in it, Giovanni Boccaccio tells the story of two merchants living in southern France, Abraham and Gianotto. Abraham is Jewish, and Gianotto is a Christian. They're good friends, they dine together, but after a time, Gianotto starts to worry about the soul of his friend Abraham. In short, he worries that Abraham, after his death, will not go to heaven. So he tries to convert him. And it's actually a very funny story because Abraham keeps saying, no, I don't want to convert, I'm perfectly happy being Jewish. And Gianotto is very concerned, he doesn't want his friend to go to hell. And finally, Abraham says, I tell you what, I have to do business in Rome. I'm going to travel to Rome, and I'm going to observe the clergy there. And, if they're really practicing what they preach, perhaps I'll convert. Oh, no. Gianotto's, no, we have a really good bishop here. You don't have to go to Rome. No, I'm doing this trip anyway. And he goes, and Gianotto despairs. Oh, no. Several months pass. Abraham comes back. They come out to dinner. And finally Gianotto says, well, what do you think? And he said, well, I visited Rome. I saw the clergy. They're engaged in the worst depravities possible. And he goes through this whole list of all these horrible things that the clergy is doing, and you just have to read it to believe it. And then he says, but I see that your religion keeps growing, and Judaism is not. So it must be the true religion, because otherwise God would have already damned it to hell. And so he converted. All right? Now let's contrast this story to another one written just a couple decades later. In his Trecento Novelle, also a Florentine writer, Franco Sacchetti relates the tale of a man who was accidentally locked in a synagogue overnight. This is tale number 24. At a certain point, biological needs happen, take over, and so he defecates in the middle of the floor of the synagogue. The next morning, when the rabbis appear, they are scandalized. Look what this man did. And so to get himself out of trouble, he says, no, your God appeared to me in the middle of the night, and this is the relic he left. And so the rabbis run forward, they pick it up, they treat it as a relic, they smear it all over themselves, and so forth. Now, both tales are intended humorously. But you can see already, just within these two tales, the perspective is very different. Boccaccio expresses the anti-Judaic perspective that Jews aren't going to go into heaven. He too was a Christian, but everything else about his story is otherwise benevolent. Towards Abraham, he's friends with Gianotto. They dine together. They're both honorable people. And Gianotto's motivations are actually very honorable. It's out of love for his friend. We may not agree with the religious view, but again, it's hard to criticize this. For Sacchetti, the anti-Judaism is a lot more offensive, treating the Jews as the foolish butt of a joke. And they're unable to distinguish matters of the spirit, obviously. And these two narratives don't even come close to some of the really horrendous views of the Jews that are very pervasive throughout the Middle Ages. Accusations of well poisoning, or accusations of the desecration of the Holy Spirit, or Holy Host, or the blood libel. This was the accusation that Jews would capture a Christian child and drain his blood and use his blood in Passover bread, which is kind of interesting from a perspective because there's no yeast in it, but there can be Christian blood in it. But we don't want to go there. And this was for Passover rites. So the question for us then is not whether Dante was anti-Judaic, because clearly he was. Rather, what we need to ask is, in what ways was Dante anti-Judaic? Now, to do that, I need to talk a little bit about the history of Judaism, or Jews in medieval Europe, and it's a 13th century discussion, so I'm going to really just summarize things very briefly. But it provides us a touchstone for how we can then move forward. And so then I'm going to talk very briefly about the history of the Jews, and then I'm going to move on to Dante. Now, one thing I want to point out, the representation of the Jews was with a yellow hat. So the Jewish man in this picture is at the far left. Right? Yeah, okay. Far right, sorry. So let's start at the beginning. In the late Empire, the late Roman Empire, Rome was becoming Christianized. The question arose, as to the continuing presence of the Jews. Should they be forced to convert like all the other religions of the empire, or should they be allowed to practice their religion in an otherwise Christian society? It was St. Augustine who came up with a theological answer, and he argued that it was God who preserved the Jews. The answer he gave is as witnesses. That is, by practicing the old law, they acted as witnesses to the truth of Jesus and to the truth and the superiority of the new law, the new Christianity. Now, not coincidentally, their abject status as diaspora Jews, as second-class or worse citizens in the Christian empire, only added to the view that the laws of Moses had indeed been surpassed by those of Christ. But this question of witnesses is very important because it provides a theological basis that would remain for a millennium. It's only in the 15th century that Augustine's idea of witnesses gets challenged and then removed. And that's when things change, but that's a century and a half after this discussion. The Emperor Justinian, decades later, codified the Roman laws. And he based the codification of the rights of the Jews in the Christian empire on Augustine's notion of witnesses. So what got codified into the law? Jews were allowed to practice their religion unmolested. They were able to teach their religion to their children. They were able to have places of worship and holy books, but they could not do anything to offend Christian sensibilities. They couldn't proselytize. And this was important. For us, it's kind of weird, but it was important at the time. They couldn't own Christian slaves. Okay? Bear in mind that late Roman Empire was based on a slave economy. And so by saying they couldn't have Christian slaves, there simply weren't enough non-Christians around for Jews to own slaves and have the latifundia. And so basically what this did was said it was a de facto prohibition on these large land ownings that other people possessed. Other popes reaffirmed Augustine's teaching that the Jews were witnesses, and through his papal bull, Sicut Judaeis, Gregory the Great went even further. He prohibited forced conversions and any type of violence against the Jews. Over time, the Jews of Rome were given a particular legal status, servi camerae papae, which made them part of the papal household. And as such, they were given special protections. By the 12th century, Rome and Salerno in Italy had the two largest Jewish communities in the peninsula. Now, it should go without saying that the need for special protections speaks of ongoing threats to this community of non-Christians within Christendom. Wherever the law was weak or ignored, abuses occurred. For instance, in southern Italy, the French royal house took over the royal throne of Naples. There was a royal seat in Naples, and it held the southern half of the peninsula. And that seat was vacated after the Battle of Benevento in 1266. When the French royalty took over that seat, they disregarded the legal status of Jews in southern Italy, so that by the last decade of the 13th century, by the 1290s, there were mass conversions throughout southern Italy, and the settlements in southern Italy, the Jewish settlements, pretty much ceased to exist by the turn of the 14th century. However, given the unique situation of Rome under the aegis of the popes, the Roman community of the Jews was the only one in Europe that survived the Middle Ages without undergoing significant dislocation. And as the economy of central and northern Italy flourished, the need for capitalization led lords and city governments to petition the Roman Jewish community to establish banks in their city-states. The Jewish communities in the communes, that is the city-states, were given a similar legal status as those of Rome, servi camerae domini, which means chamber servants of the Lord, thus affording them the protections of the state. Throughout these communities, Christians were already lending money. I mentioned earlier that Dante said that, I said that Dante doesn't have any Jews among the usurers. Well, there were a lot of Christians lending money. They were lending money at 200 to 300% interest. Somebody laughed at that. And so you can imagine why the lords would also bring in Jewish communities to lend money. If instead they're under the protection of the Lord, their interest would be limited at 20 or 30%. So you're still capitalizing your economy, but you're undercutting these other noxious Christians who are lending at 200 and 300% interest, who might then threaten you as Lord of the community. As with many aspects of all cultures, the relationship between Christians and Jews in the Middle Ages is very multifaceted and contradictory. Now, as any reader of Dante knows, he composed the comedy in the midst of this economic boom of central and northern Italy. He composed it between 1308 and 1320. And therefore, he reflects many of the teachings and attitudes about the Jews at the time. So that's why I had to do all of this discussion. Now, the first thing you will notice when you read the Divine Comedy, you really notice it when you read it in the Italian, he has two different words for Jews. Okay? And it's very distinct and very regular. He uses the word Ebreo, which is the modern word you'd use nowadays for Jewish, but it's pretty clear he's referring to the ancient Israelites of the Old Testament. He has another word that he uses, which is now pretty archaic, which is Judeo, and here I'm referring to Hebrew when I refer to Ebreo and Judeo, and this seems to refer to the Jews after the advent of Christ. So these are the Jews after the coming of Christ. These are the Jews of the ancient Israel. It's not even clear, however, if this is Dante's distinction or if it's a distinction in the language. And I'm just going to cite very briefly, there's a 14th century commentator, Jacopo della Lana. Now, he explicated the Divine Comedy between 1324 and 1328, so a few years after Dante's death. And he doesn't reflect this term. And I'll just give you a couple a couple of citations that I'm translating here. And you can hear he refers to the ancient Israelites with the word Judeo, Jews. And so you'll hear that in my translation. So he says at one point, you should remember those Jews were not part of Gideon's army. And later he says, this Nebuchadnezzar, because of the Jews' sins, had waged war on them. Okay. So what's not clear at this time, it will require a lot more study, is to know whether this is a reflective of something that Dante believed. You know, was he doing this distinction, or was this a distinction that was commonplace in the language at the time and just Jacopo della Lana didn't quite get it? Okay. There's just so much one person can do. Now, when it comes, so I'm going to start with this side, that is Hebreo, Israelites. When it comes to the ancient Israelites, Dante's representation is generally positive. Indeed, he populates half of the rows of heaven in Paradiso with the people who believed in Christ to come. This is where the souls are, God is above them, and they're accepting God's love. And half of this rose, you can see it kind of makes a rose here, is the ancient Israelites. There's a vertical line of Hebrew women that bisect the rows between the Israelites and the Christians, and I'll just read the translation. And on the 7th degree downward, as down to it, follow Hebrew women parting all the hairs of the flower. Interestingly, in Dante's representation of heaven, there are currently more Jews than Christians, but that will be remedied by the time of the universal judgment. In most instances, Dante follows the Old Testament's representation of the Israelites as God's chosen, as when he when he describes their practices of switching one offering with another of greater value. For this reason, it was necessary for the Hebrews to make offerings, although things offered could at times be changed, as you know. There it is, the word Hebrews. He also depicts them residing in residing in Israel proper, as when he portrays, let's try that again. There we go. As when he portrays them, I lost my line again. He portrays the mountain of purgatory as antipodal to Zion. So these two are on two ends of the globe. And he says, for this reason you give as far from here toward the north as the Hebrews saw it toward the heart region, that is towards the south. This passage would seem to suggest that for Dante, Hebrews, Hebreo, lived in Israel before the exiled, while the Jews, Judeo, are post-diaspora. But it's more complicated than that, because the switch from Hebrew to Jew may have occurred before the expulsion of 70 CE. Now, it should be said that Dante's representation of the ancient Israelites is not universally positive. Rather, when the Old Testament portrays the Hebrews negatively, so does Dante. In Purgatorio 24, he uses them as an example of gluttony when the soldiers of Gideon stopped to drink water with their mouths like dogs instead of using their hands. And the Hebrews who were so indulgent in drinking that Gideon would not take them as comrades as when he went down the hills towards Midian. In keeping with the narrative, Dante does not intend all the Israelites in this passage, but only those who lapped the water with their tongues. They were separated out from the army, and hence were not part of the victory over the Midianites, and this is from Judges chapter 7, verses 5 through 7. Later, Dante describes Moses in heaven as having led, quote, that ungrateful, fickle, backsliding people. Almost all the 14th century commentators view this statement as derived from the book of Exodus, however. One commentator, however, Jacopo della Lana, interprets it both as reflecting Exodus and as a statement about the contemporary Jews who still reject Christ. Now, interestingly, this is the very same commentator who I just mentioned, who didn't distinguish between Jews and Israelites. But whether this is reflective of a personal view about the Jews or it's just purely accidental, again, we need to study it more in depth. Now, from this point, I want to go to Judeo, which I'm translating as Jews. These are the people who live in the Christian era, that is after Christ's coming. When it comes to the Jews of the post-Christian, or the Christian era, Dante's views shift. In the Italian language of the time, a number of negative connotations had accrued to the word Jew, Judeo. This is from the Vocabolario della Crusca, which is a dictionary of literary Italian. It was compiled towards the end of the 16th century, so about a couple centuries after Dante's life. But you can see the word Jew, Judeo, is rather negative. Jew of Judea, for those who live according to the old laws of Moses, from Latin Judaeus, for obstinate unbeliever, and from Latin perfidus and obstinatus. Now, let's look a little bit more at the word. Another typical connotation of the word Jew is that of usurer, to the point where Jew and usurer had become virtually synonymous. Many medieval thinkers also punned on the similarity between the word Jew or Judeo and the name Judas. suggesting the Jews as a type of archetypal traitor. If Dante is playing on any of these negative terms or negative connotations to the word Jew, however, he would be doing so in an extraordinarily subtle way. We don't see them there. When Dante encounters the usurers in hell, he only finds Christians. I've already mentioned that. Furthermore, Dante names the very last circle of hell, reserved for traitors, as Judaica, which is the near-perfect Italianization of Judaica, from Judea. However, nobody seems to make that connection. He doesn't spell it out. All the other portions of this area in hell are named after individuals, and so this is named after Judas. And all the 14th century commentators uniformly explain the name as Judaica as derived from Judas. Nothing to do with Judea or Jewish. So if there was an anti-Judaic tone in this name, nobody's mentioning it. And that's really rare among the commentators. They always spell out the most obvious things. So I find it hard to believe that they missed it if it's supposed to be there. But at the same time, there are no Jews in limbo. There are no Jews in the purgatory. In fact, there are no Jews anywhere in Dante's afterlife. So at first glance, it seems that Dante is immune to some of the more slanderous depictions of the contemporary Jews. And when I say contemporary Jews, I mean Jews of his age. But three passages are really significant to tease out the way he viewed the Jews in the Christian era. And so the rest of my talk is going to look at these three basic passages. In Paradiso 7, Dante explains the nature of the Jews' deicide. Now, what he's doing is he spends quite a lot of time explaining why it was that if the crucifixion was a good thing, why is it that the Jews are punished with exile? Why would you punish for a good thing? Okay? And the way he explains it, and I've only given you a small portion of the explanation here, and you can see he goes back to the dual nature of Jesus. Jesus was both fully human and fully divine. The fully human part was complicit in the original sin. By killing Jesus the man, they're fulfilling God's law, but in killing Christ the God, deicide, they're killing God. So you can see that on the one hand, they're doing something positive, on the other hand, they're doing something negative. The only way I can look at this personally is go, right? It's a bit of a hair splitting, but I didn't write it. But he is presenting the Jews as deicides. Later in Paradiso, he argues against the idea that an eclipse caused the sky to darken when Jesus died on the cross. And here he says that people throughout the world saw this eclipse. So it wouldn't be an eclipse, which is local, but it seems to have been universal. He says the so-called eclipse was seen by the Spaniards, that is at the far west of Europe, and the Jews in Israel. In both these cases, Dante does not describe the residents of Jerusalem during Jesus' crucifixion as Israelites. And this is an important point. Even before Jesus died, it seems, those who rejected him, in Dante's eyes, ceased being Hebrews and became Jews, that is, and stopped being Hebreo and became Judeo. It appears that Dante is according with Paul's argument from the New Testament that those who did not accept Jesus stopped being Israelites, and that the believers in Jesus supplanted them as the new Hebrews, and that Christianity was the new Israel. By rejecting Christ as the Messiah, they apparently forfeit their birthright as God's chosen. Now, another passage elaborates further on this perspective that by rejecting Jesus, they stop being God's chosen. When Dante and Virgil arrive among the hypocrites in the 8th circle of hell, Virgil is surprised by something unexpected. Now, if you've read the Inferno before, Virgil has taken the journey through hell before. And so every so often when there's something new, he's like, what the heck is this? This circle is dedicated to fraud. And specifically, this is a subsection of fraud that deals with hypocrisy. The hypocrites wear heavy robes that are beautiful on the outside and gilded on the, beautiful and gilded on the outside, but heavy and leaded on the inside. They can barely carry this load at a very slow pace. And stretched out on the ground below them, crucified on the ground below them, is the high rabbi Caiaphas, who must be trampled by them as they walk by. Now, Virgil is surprised by this. Caiaphas wasn't there before, because when he did the journey, it was before Jesus' death. And the damned soul Catalano explains this situation. That one staked out there, at whom you are looking, counseled the Pharisees that it was expedient to put one man to death for the people. He is stretched naked out across the road, as you see, so that whoever passes, he must feel his weight first. And his father-in-law is laid out in the same way in this ditch, and the others of the council that sowed so ill for the Jews. Now there's a lot here to pull apart. Along with his father-in-law Annas, Caiaphas was a member of the Sanhedrin, the rabbinical council of Jerusalem. Caiaphas called for the crucifixion of Jesus, saying, quote, "It is better that one man die for the people than the whole nation perish." This is from John chapter 11, verse 50. Dante notes the irony that by hoping to save the Jewish people, Caiaphas actually brought about the exile of them for their part in the crucifixion. As we just saw in Paradiso 7, the expulsion of 70 CE was the proper retribution for the killing of God. Yet there's a lot more here in this passage. Caiaphas is a special form of hypocrite, suggesting that he really knew the truth about Jesus, but he chose to ignore it. Caiaphas, in short, may embody the Jew as a deliberate unbeliever. If so, and I really think that's there because it's expedient to put one man to death for the people, but it's not clear that that would apply to all the Jewish people. And here's why. There are a number of anti-clerical elements of this canto. Dante begins by depicting him and Virgil as walking unaccompanied, quote, "as friars minor go along their way." And then he describes the hypocrites' hoods pulled down over their eyes, quote, "made in the fashion that is sewn in Cluny for the monks." And the hypocrites identify themselves as jolly friars, members of a lay order, which was known at the time as frati gaudenti. They're really living it up. Caiaphas and Annas were rabbis, so as such they form part of this anti-clerical pattern in the canto. Now, throughout the comedy, Dante speaks very harshly about clerics who deliberately deceive their followers, particularly when their words cause harm to the flock, and especially if it causes damnation. So when he describes the actions of Caiaphas and the other rabbis, he's probably casting them as deliberate unbelievers. But he also seems to be casting the other Jews as spiritually blind or deceived, in keeping with Augustine's characterization of the Jews as spiritually blind. The third passage from the comedy also warrants really close examination. The fifth canto of Paradiso, Beatrice explains the nature of vows, and she exhorts people to be careful in making them. She urges Christians to be very slow in making vows. And then she adds, if evil greed or some other word, if evil greed shouts some other word, be human beings, not brainless sheep, so that the Jew might not laugh at you in your midst. Now, what does Beatrice mean by the Jew laughing at you from in your midst? The 19th century writer Flaminio Servi posited that it may have been intended as complimentary, contrasting the practices of the observant Jews to the misbehaviors of incautious Christians. I really don't think so. Others have suggested that it may have been Emmanuel himself, Emmanuel of Rome, who was laughing. But again, that's a discredited idea that Emmanuel and Dante really knew each other. Now, to understand this a little further, we can look at a couple other passages from Dante's works and see that it's a pretty close translation to a couple of other passages. This is from one of Dante's epistles. We have 13 epistles that are extant. We know he wrote more. And one of them, he's chastising the cardinals of Italy because they've moved the Holy Seat from Rome to Avignon. And so he says, the Jews, the Saracens, the Gentiles, committers of impious acts, they all laugh at our sacred festivals. So it sounds very close to that, laughing at you from amongst your midst. And if fame carries the truth, they proclaim, where is their God? Elsewhere, in Paradiso, he says something fairly similar. He says that the Persians, that is to say Muslims, will condemn corrupt Christian leaders when they learn of their crimes. What will the Persians be able to say to your kings when they shall see that the volume opened in which all their dispraise is being written? Now, the pairing of Jew and Saracen was very commonplace, and it's commonplace for Dante too. In this instance, he seems to be echoing the Crusader ethos of the times. In another instance, he criticizes, this is Boniface VIII, who he has no good words for waging war not on Jews or Muslims, but on religionists, that is, other Christians, the prince of the new Pharisees making war near the Lateran and not against Saracens or Jews. In this context, the Jew laughing at the Christians does not appear complimentary. That is, with these passages in mind, I think it's safe to say that this is not meant positively. Rather, the Jews' laughter is deriding the Christians for their failings. But the derisive Jew looks like he's an outsider who happens to live among Christians. In other words, he's an external threat who resides among the Christians, the non-Christian within Christendom. Now, in one last point, and then I'll conclude. In a very interesting twist, this verse about the Jews' derisive laughter of Christians was known to the 14th century Jews of Italy. We have a manuscript that originated in Livorno, Leghorn, and it's now found in Jerusalem. It's shelf number 616. And it contains verses of the comedy transliterated into Hebrew characters. It's not translated into Hebrew. You read it aloud and you pronounce them as Italian words. Okay, but it's with Hebrew characters. Sorry, I'm going right, left. It has to go the other direction. So it's quite interesting. There are various passages. The manuscript may have been transcribed actually by a relative of Emmanuel of Rome, that's Jehuda Romano, and the passages deal primarily with theological or philosophical questions. But among the verses is this discussion of vows, with the claim that the Jews laugh at the Christians from among the Christians. Now, here's the sad thing. The passage is there and you can read it aloud, but they don't comment on this particular passage. So we have no idea what they meant, why they transcribed it, transcribed it, and what they thought about it. It's just there. And that's a shame, because it would be very interesting to think, why did they transcribe it? What were they thinking? What were they seeing when they heard that verse? In conclusion, Dante's anti-Judaism is entirely consistent with many of the teachings of the time. He considers the ancient Israelites as God's chosen people, but when they rejected Christ, they forfeited that status. The punishment for their rejection of Christ was the diaspora and their continuing abject condition. The medieval Jews of Italy may have been spiritually blind, possibly led by deliberate unbelievers like Caiaphas. Now, all of this comes out of the theological teachings at the time, but we also see references to the historical situation. They were also viewed, and you can see it right here, they were also cast as a menace, an internal threat to the greater Christian community. Nothing about Dante's representation is unusual. But it isn't necessarily as kind as we would like it, and it isn't necessarily as ugly as many other people at the time wrote about it. And that's the important point. It's sort of right in the middle. So in conclusion, I want to just say one other thing. I actually, when discussing this, resist the old dictum, he simply reflects the times he lived in. That is a truism, of course. All people reflect the times they live in. We reflect the times we live in. Yet there are a couple reasons why I don't like this explanation. First, Dante is an extremely subtle thinker. I'm starting to sound like Sylvester Cat. Not one to simply accept what was taught to him. And there's no other instance where we say, oh, Dante simply reflects the times. No, because he's actually culling together all sorts of different attitudes, beliefs. He's pulling together all sorts of teachings. And we kind of see this here too. He's not taking one attitude, but he pulls several together. So if we don't say that for other instances, why would we bother saying it here? And this leads me to my second point. When people repeat the dictum, it's usually in a misguided attempt to defend the writer, or rather, a two-dimensional version of the writer. Dante's work is monumental, and there are portions of the work that we just now find unacceptable. If that's the case, so be it. We can admire the grandeur of the comedy. There's a lot there to admire. I teach it every year. But we can still reject his characterization, in this case, of the post-diaspora Jews. People have read the Divine Comedy for 700 years now, and they're going to continue to read it whether we find things that we like or dislike. So I'm not worried about defending him. As I see it, Dante needs no reason. He doesn't need me to defend him in the slightest. And with that, thank you all.